If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously ordered, predictably beige life, would be irrevocably altered by a man who communicated primarily in grunts and the percussive slam of a hammer, I would have politely cataloged their suggestion under fiction. Unlikely my world was one of quiet corridors and the hushed rustle of turning pages. It was a fortress built of dewy decimal codes and the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper. And I was its solitary, contented king. My kingdom was the Atherton Public Library, a century-old cathedral of stone and wood that was like me, showing its age in quiet, dignified ways. My days were a soothing loop of familiar tasks, checking in returns, mending spines with careful fingers, guiding lost patrons through the labyrinth of shelves. Solitude was not a burden. It was a blanket, a soft, worn thing I pulled around myself, muffling the chaotic noise of the outside world. Then came the renovation, and, with the renovation, came him, Julian Vance. His name felt too grand for the man I first saw. He was less of a Julian and more of a thunderclap. He strode into my quiet sanctuary with steel-toed boots that echoed on the marble floors like gunshots, his presence a raw, physical affront to the library's sacred hush. He was the lead on the restoration project, a man tasked with saving the building's bones while I was merely the caretaker of its soul. From my perch at the circulation desk, I watched him. It became a new, unsanctioned part of my routine. He was a man carved from harder material than the rest of us. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of his dusty T-shirts, and his arms, corded with muscle and dusted with fine sawdust, moved with an unsettling economy of motion. Everything about him was loud. The way he laughed with his crew, a booming sound that made the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. The way he'd shout measurements across the cavernous main hall. The way his very existence seemed to suck the quiet out of any room he entered. He was, in a word, terrifying. He was everything my life was not. Unstructured, unpredictable, visceral. He was a storm raging just outside my carefully sealed windows. And I, the quiet king in my quiet castle, found myself watching the storm with a fascination that bordered on obsession. Our interactions were minimal, transactional. A curt nod in the morning. A muttered, "Excuse me," as he hauled a ladder past my desk. He seemed to look right through me, his gaze sweeping over my slight frame and sensible sweaters as if I were just another piece of library furniture. A book card. A card catalog. Inconsequential. This established the distance between us more effectively than any wall. He was the physical world, all grit and sweat and solid matter. I was the world of abstracts, of thoughts and histories, a ghost haunting the stacks. We were two different languages, and neither of us had any interest in a translation. Or so I told myself. The truth was a more complicated, more shameful thing. I was intensely aware of him. I knew the specific cadence of his boots on the floorboards. I knew he took his coffee black with 2 sugars because I'd watched the new girl at the cafe across the street get his order wrong once. And the gentle way he corrected her was a jarring contradiction to his brutish exterior. I knew he had a small, jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow, visible only when the afternoon light hit him, just so. These details I collected like rare first editions, storing them away in a secret, unlit corner of my mind. For months, this was our dynamic. The observer and the observed. The silence and the storm. A perfectly stable, perfectly safe distance. I was content with this arrangement. It allowed me to feel something, a flicker of heat, a jolt of awareness without any of the risk. I could admire the fire without ever having to fear being burned. The disruption, when it came, didn't knock politely. It tore the door off its hinges. The storm that had been brewing outside my windows for days decided to come inside. It started with a flicker of the lights, a common occurrence in the old building. Then came the wind, a low, mournful howl that rattled the massive arched windows in their frames. The rain began not as a drizzle, but as a solid sheet of water thrown against the glass. Patrons, sensing the shift in the weather's mood, began to trickle out, clutching books to their chests like shields. Soon it was just me and the skeleton crew of construction workers, their voices echoing in the growing emptiness. Julian was at the far end of the main hall, arguing with the city inspector on his phone, his voice a low rumble of frustration under the symphony of the storm. Then a sound like the world splitting in two, a deafening crack of thunder, simultaneous with a flash of lightning that bleached the world white for a second. The lights didn't just flicker this time. They died. Utterly. We were plunged into a profound, velvety darkness, the only illumination coming from the strobing flashes outside. A collective curse went up from the workers. My heart, a frantic bird, beat against the cage of my ribs. And then another sound, a groaning, splintering noise from above, followed by the terrifying crash of something heavy meeting the floor. Julian's voice cut through the chaos, no longer a rumble but a sharp, authoritative crack. Everyone stay put. Sound off. Emergency lights flickered on, casting the hall in a sickly, greenish glow. At the far end, near the new scaffolding, a massive oak beam, one of the original ceiling supports weakened by decades of hidden rot and now shaken loose by the storm, lay shattered on the floor. It had crushed a section of shelving, sending books and splintered wood across the marble. More terrifyingly, it had completely blocked the main entrance. We were trapped. The forced proximity was immediate and absolute. The city declared a state of emergency. The roads were flooded, power was out across the entire district, and the library's ancient front doors were buried under a ton of historic timber. We were stuck. Me, Julian, and his three-man crew. Stuck for the night, at the very least. My routine was not just disrupted, it was obliterated. My quiet fortress had been breached, and the storm was now inside, wearing a dusty t-shirt and a thunderous expression. Julian, ever the man of action, immediately took charge. He got his men checking for other structural damage with powerful flashlights, their beams cutting sharp cones through the dusty, dark air. He found the building's emergency supply closet, pulling out blankets and bottles of water. He moved with a purpose that made my own anxious stillness feel shameful. I retreated to my circulation desk, my only remaining piece of familiar territory. It felt like a tiny, useless lifeboat in a vast, dark ocean. He found me there an hour later. His flashlight beams swept over me, and I flinched. "You all right?" His voice was gruff, but the question was not. It was direct. Simple. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. "We're stuck here for the night," he stated, as if I hadn't figured that out. "My guys are bunking down in the staff lounge. You could take the office. It's at a couch." He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned and walked away, his heavy boots echoing in the profound silence between thunderclaps. It wasn't a conversation. It was a decree. And yet, it was the most he'd ever said to me. Later, huddled in the director's office, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that smelled of mothballs, I couldn't sleep. The building groaned around us, a wounded beast settling into the dark. I could hear the low murmur of the other men from the lounge down the hall, but Julian was not with them. I knew this with an instinct I couldn't explain. Driven by a restlessness that was entirely foreign to me, I crept out of the office. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that made the familiar stacks look menacing, alien. I found him in the main hall, standing before the wreckage of the fallen beam. His flashlight was off. He was just a broad silhouette against the flashing, stormlit windows. I watched him from the shadows of the history section. I was close now, closer than I'd ever been. Close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. The arrogant confidence I'd always perceived from a distance was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that looked a lot like weariness. He wasn't a storm. He was just a man standing in the middle of one. In the intermittent flashes of lightning, I saw details I'd never noticed from across the room. The faint tracing of silver at his temples. The way the fabric of his shirt was worn thin across his shoulder blades. The calloused, capable look of his hands as they rested on his hips. He looked less like a force of nature and more like a man carrying a heavy weight. A weight much heavier than a fallen oak beam. He must have sensed me, a shift in the air, a breath that wasn't his own. He turned, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes before the mask of indifference slammed back down. It wasn't annoyance. It was vulnerability, a raw, unguarded look that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He was startled. He hadn't known anyone was watching. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. His voice was softer in the dark, stripped of its usual bravado. I shook my head, stepping out from behind a shelf. "The building makes too much noise." A humorless smirk touched his lips. "She's an old girl. Got a lot of aches and pains." He gestured with his chin toward the mess. "This one's my fault. I should have seen it. The rot in that beam, it was a confession. An admission of fallibility from a man I had thought incapable of it. The power dynamic, the one where he was the competent force and I was the invisible observer, trembled. "You couldn't have known," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate in the vast, dark space. The inspector signed off on it. He just grunted, turning back to the window. We stood in silence for a long time, a silence that was different from the ones before. It wasn't a space between us, but a space that held us both. It was shared. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then, one of the last remaining emergency lights overhead began to flicker violently, threatening to plunge our corner of the hall into complete darkness. It buzzed, a wounded insect, its lights sputtering erratically. Without thinking, I said, "There's a junction box in the ceiling panel just above it. Sometimes the wiring comes loose." Julian turned to look at me. A real look, his head tilted in genuine curiosity. "You know about that?" "I know where all the bodies are buried," I replied, a ghost of a smile on my own lips. "I've worked here for 10 years. You learn the building's secrets." He retrieved a small stepladder from a nearby supply cart. As he positioned it under the flickering light, he glanced back at me. "Gonna need you to hold this steady. And hold the light." He handed me his heavy-duty flashlight. It was surprisingly warm from his grip. My heart hammered. This was proximity. Intentional. Necessary. I held the base of the ladder, my knuckles brushing the dusty metal. He climbed up, his weight making the ladder creak. I aimed the beam of light upwards, illuminating the small square of the ceiling panel. My hand was shaking. He popped the panel open, revealing a tangle of ancient, cloth-wrapped wires. He grunted in frustration. "Can't see a damn thing." "The angle's wrong." He shifted his weight, leaning out. "Move the light a little to the left." "Higher." I adjusted my grip, my arm aching from the weight of the flashlight. And then it happened. As he reached deeper into the ceiling, his other hand came down, seeking purchase, and landed directly on top of mine on the ladder's rung. It was like a lightning strike, but internal. A searing, brilliant heat that shot up my arm and exploded in my chest. His hand was rough, calloused, and impossibly large, completely engulfing my own. I could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of his blood against my skin. My breath hitched. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. My skin on his skin. A simple, accidental touch that felt like the most significant event of my life. I think I stopped breathing. My mind went completely blank, a pure white screen of sensory overload. All I knew was the shocking, solid weight of his hand, the rough texture, the heat. It was over in a second. He found his balance, moved his hand away to fiddle with a wire, and the connection was broken. But the ghost of his touch remained, a brand on my skin. "Got it," he muttered, twisting a wire nut. The light above us stopped flickering and burned with a steady, sickly green. The crisis was over. He climbed down the ladder, his face unreadable in the harsh light. Did he feel it? Did he even notice? Of course he didn't. To him, it was nothing. A handhold. A moment of stability. To me, it was a cataclysm. "Thanks," he said, taking the flashlight back from my nerveless fingers. Our hands didn't touch this time. I was almost grateful. I didn't think I could survive it again. He was about to turn away when a new sound reached us. A low, gurgling hiss, followed by the unmistakable spray of water. It was coming from the direction of the rare book room in the basement. Julian let out a string of curses that was truly impressive in its creativity. A burst pipe, of course, just what we needed. He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and looked back at me. You said you know the building's secrets. Where's the main water shutoff? And just like that, the ground shifted beneath my feet. He was asking me for help. He, the man of action, the fixer, was looking at me, the quiet man of books, for solution. It's not where you'd think, I said, my voice steadier now, anchored by a sudden surge of purpose. The original blueprints are in the archives. They moved the shutoff during the 1950s expansion. It's behind a false wall in the old boiler room. He stared at me for a beat, his expression a mixture of surprise and respect. Yes, that's what it was. A flicker of genuine respect. Lead the way. Librarian. He called me librarian. Not as an insult, not as a dismissal, but as a title. A recognition of my expertise. I led him through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the library's underbelly, my small, cheap keychain flashlight, a pathetic companion to his powerful beam. But I knew the way. I didn't need the light. This was my territory. We found the boiler room, a cavern of rusted metal and cobwebs. I showed him the section of wall that sounded hollow when you knocked on it. He took a crowbar from his belt and, with a few deft, powerful motions, pried the paneling away, revealing a space behind it filled with pipes and a large, red wheel valve. The sound of rushing water was deafening now. He put his shoulder to the wheel, grunting with effort. It was rusted tight. It's not budging. You have to turn it counterintuitively, I said, remembering a note from an old maintenance log. There's a gear slip. You have to jiggle it left first, hard, then right. He shot me a skeptical look, then did as I said. There was a groan of protesting metal, a loud clank, and the wheel began to turn. Slowly, the sound of rushing water subsided, replaced by a dripping echo. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, sweat sheening on his forehead. He looked at me, and for the first time, he really smiled. Not a smirk, a genuine, tired, grateful smile. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. You're full of surprises, aren't you? He said, his voice low and a little rough. My stomach did a slow, dizzying flip. I just read a lot. We made our way to the rare book room to assess the damage. The water had been contained to a corner, but several crates of acquisitions waiting to be accessioned were soaked. We worked together in the dark, moving the salvageable books to a high, dry shelf. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We fell into a rhythm, a silent dance of lifting and passing, our hands brushing occasionally. Each time, that jolt of electricity. But it was less terrifying now, more grounding. Exhausted, we finally found our way to a small, secluded reading nook in the archives. It was windowless, insulated from the storm, and blessedly dry. It was a pocket of absolute silence and stillness in the heart of the chaos. We sat on the floor, our backs against a row of shelves, our legs stretched out before us. The only light was the soft glow from Julian's flashlight, which he placed on the floor between us, pointing at the ceiling. The space was intimate, dangerously so. Our shoulders were only inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the faint, masculine scent of sawdust, sweat, and the damp night air clinging to his clothes. It was intoxicating. We sat in that shared silence for what felt like an eternity. The carefully constructed walls I had built around myself were crumbling, washed away by the storm and the events of the night. I felt exposed, raw. It was Julian who broke the silence. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its earlier bravado. It was the voice of a man speaking in the dark, believing he might not be heard. You know, I watch you sometimes. The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All the blood in my body seemed to rush to my head. He watches me? I turned to look at him, but his face was cast in shadow. I could only see the outline of his jaw, the dark shape of him. He continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. You have this way of being so quiet, so still, like you're holding your breath, waiting for something. I see you at your desk, the way your hands move when you're fixing a book. It's careful. Gentle, he paused. My whole life is about force. Pushing things, pulling them, hammering them into place. I break things to fix them. I don't think you've ever broken a thing in your life, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. He sees me. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The invisible man was visible after all. I see you too, I whispered, the confession tumbling out of me before I could stop it. I noticed the scar on your eyebrow, and that you're kinder than you let on. He turned his head then, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. The space between us crackled with a tension that was no longer about a storm or a burst pipe. It was something else entirely, something fragile and powerful and new. People see what they want to see, he said, his voice barely a murmur. They see this. He gestured to his own large frame. They see a guy who can swing a hammer. They don't look closer. They don't want to. I wanted to. I admitted the truth of it hanging in the air between us. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching my face. I felt stripped bare, every hidden feeling, every secret observation, laid out for his inspection. I expected him to laugh, to mock me, to retreat back into a shell of gruff indifference. Instead, he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He lifted his hand, the one that had accidentally covered mine on the ladder, and gently, hesitantly, touched my cheek. His calloused fingertips were rough against my skin, but the touch was unbelievably soft. A question. My breath caught in my throat. This is it. This is real. I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, a silent answer. My eyes fluttered shut. He shifted closer, the fabric of his jeans whispering against mine. The heat of his body was an inferno now. I could feel his breath on my face, warm and smelling faintly of coffee. The silence in the small room was absolute, a perfect vacuum waiting to be filled. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was slow, tentative, a soft pressure, a gentle exploration. It was as hesitant and questioning as his touch had been. It tasted of rain and exhaustion and a loneliness so profound it mirrored my own. I responded with all the pent-up longing I had stored away for years, a quiet, desperate confession of my own. My hands, of their own accord, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was just as frantic as my own. The strong, silent man was just as scared as I was. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more sure. It was a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of the invisible thread that had been stretching between us for months. It was a storm breaking, not in fury, but in a quiet, cleansing release. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. I'm not good at this, he breathed, the words a raw, vulnerable admission. Me neither, I whispered back, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. We didn't say anything else. We just stayed there in the dark, in the quiet heart of the library, our foreheads touching, our breath mingling in the small space between us. Eventually, exhaustion claimed us. We curled up on the hard floor, my back pressed against his chest, his arm wrapped securely around me, a solid, comforting weight. For the first time in my life, I fell asleep feeling utterly, completely safe. Not alone. The morning after came with a harsh, unwelcome intrusion of reality. The gray light of dawn filtered down the stairwell, and with it came the sounds of civilization returning. Voices, the distant groan of heavy machinery. We had been found. I woke up first. I was still wrapped in Julian's arms, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. For a moment, a perfect, crystalline moment, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. The world was right. This was right. Then the anxiety began to creep in a cold, insidious fog. What was this? A moment of weakness in the dark? A fluke brought on by stress and proximity? The man holding me was Julian Vance, the loud, confident, intensely masculine man who lived in a world so different from my own. What could he possibly want with me, the quiet, bookish man who was more comfortable with fictional characters than real people? I must have stirred because he tensed behind me. His arm loosened its hold. He sat up, running a hand over his face. The spell was broken. Sounds like they're clearing the entrance, he said. His voice was back to its old, gruff tone. The softness of the night was gone. I sat up too, pulling my knees to my chest, a defensive posture. I couldn't look at him. The silence between us now was not the shared, comfortable silence of the archives. It was a thick, awkward thing, heavy with unspoken questions and the bright, unforgiving light of day. He stood up, stretching his back with a groan. He didn't look at me. He just stared toward the stairwell, toward the sounds of our rescue. I should go help, he muttered, and then he was gone. He just walked away. No word about last night. No glance back. Nothing. He just left me there, on the floor of the archives, the ghost of his warmth still on my skin, my heart plummeting into a cold, dark abyss. It was a mistake. A terrible, foolish mistake. I had misread everything. The vulnerability, the confession, the kiss, it was a product of the storm. A strange dream in the dark. Now, in the light of day, reality had reasserted itself. When I finally emerged, the main hall was bustling with activity. Firefighters were cutting through the last of the beam. Julian was in the middle of it all, directing people, shouting orders, completely in his element. He was the man I had first seen, the force of nature. He glanced in my direction once, his eyes skittering past me as if I wasn't there, as if I were a book card again. Inconsequential. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, brutal ache in my chest. I had let him in. I had dismantled my own fortress, brick by painstaking brick, and for what? To be left shivering in the ruins. I went home. My small, quiet apartment felt different. It felt empty. The solitude that had once been my comfort was now a gaping wound. It was no longer a chosen state of being. It was an absence. The absence of him. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was just silent. It echoed with the memory of his voice in the dark, the feel of his lips on mine. A day passed. Then, too, the library was closed for repairs. I had no reason to go in, no reason to see him, and he made no effort to see me. My phone remained silent. Each passing hour was another confirmation of my foolishness. My anxiety spiraled. I replayed every moment of that night, dissecting every word, every touch, searching for the clue I had missed. I tortured myself with the memory of his smile, the raw honesty in his voice. Had I imagined all? My logical mind, the librarian part of my brain, told me to catalog the event under experience, painful, and move on. Rebuild the walls. Reinforce the solitude. It was safer there. But my heart, that traitorous, stupid organ, refused to cooperate. It kept whispering his name in the suffocating silence of my apartment. On the third day, I had convinced myself it was over. I was a fool, an interlude, a convenient port in a storm. I was in the process of systematically erasing him from my memory, a task as impossible as unreading a book when my doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat. It couldn't be. No one ever came to my apartment. I didn't have visitors. I peered through the peephole, and the world tilted on its axis. It was him, Julian. He was standing in my hallway, looking as out of place as a redwood tree in a potted plant nursery. He wasn't wearing his work clothes. He was in jeans and a simple gray Henley that stretched across his chest. He was holding a small, clumsily wrapped package. He looked nervous. His big, capable hands were fidgeting with the package, and he was shifting his weight from foot to foot. My own fear was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to hear the apology, the let's just forget it happened speech. It would be easier to pretend he was never there. But the memory of his forehead pressed against mine, of his whispered confession, pushed me forward. I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. He looked up, and the relief that washed over his face was so palpable it stole my breath. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," I replied, my own voice a reedy whisper. An awkward silence stretched between us. He was the one who broke it, thrusting the package toward me. "This is for you," I took it. It was a small, heavy wooden box. The joinery was perfect, the wood grained smooth and rich under my fingertips. I didn't need to open it to know he had made it himself. Can I come in?" he asked, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I stepped back and let him pass. He filled my small living room, his presence overwhelming the space. He looked around at my neat, ordered world, the books stacked perfectly, the minimalist furniture, and he looked deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to face me. The words came out in a rush. "For just leaving. At the library. I'm not. I'm not good with—" He gestured vaguely between us. What is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I needed to know. I needed him to name it. He took a deep breath, and finally he met my eyes. The vulnerability was back, raw and unguarded in the afternoon light of my apartment. "You," he said. "Me. What happened?" I panicked. It was a lot. It was too good, and that scared the hell out of me. My carefully constructed anger began to dissolve, replaced by fragile, terrifying hope. "I don't do feelings," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I do work. I build things. I fix things. I know how to do that. But this feels like something I could break. And I don't want to break it." He took a step closer. "These last few days, not seeing you, not talking to you, it's been worse than any storm. The silence is too loud." He used my own words. The silence. He felt it too. The aching void. "I thought you regretted it." I confessed, my voice trembling. "I thought it was a mistake." "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "God, no. It was the only thing that's felt real in a long time." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us for a second, before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek. "I've spent my whole life building walls, Elias. Keeping people out. It's safer that way. But that night with you, I didn't want a wall. I wanted a door, and there it was. The clarifying conversation. The truth laid bare in the quiet of my living room. All my fears, my anxieties, were just echoes of his own. We were both terrified of this new, uncharted territory. But we were both standing at its border, wanting to cross. "What's in the box?" I asked, my voice thick. He smiled, a real smile, the one that reached his eyes. "Open it." My fingers fumbled with the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of wood shavings, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. A sparrow. Its wings were outstretched, as if in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing. Every tiny feather was perfect. "It's a house sparrow," he said softly. "They're tough. They build their nests in the cracks of old buildings. They make a home wherever they can. They're not fancy, but they're survivors." It was a symbolic gesture so perfect, so thoughtful, it made my heart ache. He saw me not as a fragile thing, but as a survivor. He had taken the time to create this, to imbue it with meaning. It was a promise, a tangible piece of his world, offered to mine. I looked up from the bird to his face. "Julian," I breathed. "Let me take you to dinner," he said, his voice firm now, full of a new resolve. "A real date. No storms. No varspipes. Just you and me." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of reassurance, of commitment, a promise of a new beginning. And it was. That first date led to a second, and then a third. We learned each other's languages. I learned about different types of wood and the satisfying finality of a well-driven nail. He learned about the quiet poetry of card catalogs and the history hidden in the marginalia of old books. He brought his sturdy, grounded presence into my quiet world, and I brought a gentle stillness into his chaotic one. Slowly, his things began to appear in my apartment. A pair of worn work boots by the door. A heavy flannel shirt draped over a chair. His ridiculously large coffee mug next to my delicate teacup on the kitchen counter. My fortress of solitude was becoming a shared home, and I had never felt safer. Now, my mornings look different. I wake up not to silence, but to the sound of his steady breathing beside me. The sun filters through the blinds, and I watch the dust motes dance in its beams. They no longer look like lonely particles. They look like tiny, glittering promises. This morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I padded into the kitchen to find him there, his broad back to me as he stood at the counter. He was wearing just a pair of sweatpants, and the early light caught the intricate muscles of his back, the landscape of a man I was still learning, still exploring. He turned, holding out a mug. My mug, the big one. "Morning, librarian," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. The smile he gave me was soft and easy and just for me. I took the coffee, our fingers brushing. The jolt was still there, that familiar spark of electricity. But it wasn't a shock anymore. It was just a pleasant, steady warmth. The feeling of coming home. I looked back at the man I was a year ago, the solitary king in his castle of silence, and I barely recognize him. My life was so carefully ordered, so predictable. I thought that was safety. I thought that was peace. I was wrong. Julian Vance was a storm I never knew I needed. He was the plot twist that ripped my story apart and then helped me put it back together into something infinitely better, infinitely more real. He wasn't a disruption to my life. He was the beginning of it. He was the man who said he couldn't let his guard down. But for me, he tore down the whole damn fortress. And in the beautiful, shared rubble, we built a home.